¿Quieres cogerla? ¿Se puede poner el audio por arriba?
Es mejor que si, bueno, sí. Yo creo que está por defecto directamente por arriba, pero casi es mejor tu
Ok. Sí, lo dejamos con el mío. Okay, Matthew? Can you hear me? Matthew, can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
¿Lo escucháis bien? ¿Sí? ¿Vosotros al fondo? ¿Sí? Right, okay. So, you see, we are here in a meetup. Let's say hello to all the fellows here. And welcome.
Hola.
Hola. Hola. Son las 4 ahí de la madrugada. Así que, okay, we will start the live stream. And las 4 ahí de la madrugada. ¿Este?
Eso, sí.
Sí, está bien.
Ahí está. Y ahí está. Vale, ya está.
Okay. Okay, let's start, Matthew, okay?
Yep.
Are you yes? Okay.
Yeah, I'm good. Just finding my notes.
Sí, estamos con, no sé, ¿alguien no conoce Matthew? M-Fractor. ¿Y M-Fractor quién no conoce? ¿Vale? Que es un IDE para Visual Studio for Mac, como ReSharper, ¿no? Y la está haciendo él solito para Visual Studio for Mac, ¿vale? Una gran herramienta. Así que, básicamente se dedica a crear esa tool y lo poquito que le sobra, pues, echar una mano a la comunidad, ¿no? Que tampoco es poca cosa. Así que le cedo y que empiece a contarnos las novedades de Xamarin Forms, ¿vale? Va a ser en inglés. Okay, Matthew, I tell that you are the creator of M-Fractor and one of the most important men in the community of Xamarin. So here we are, listening you for the news of Xamarin Forms 4. Okay?
Yep. Cool. Thank you so much for the very kind intro. That's quite flattering. Hi everyone. Unfortunately, my Spanish is not very good. Otherwise, I would love to be able to do this presentation in Spanish, but alas, not quite there. Today, I'm talking about Xamarin Forms 4. So this is the coming release of Xamarin Forms. It adds some fairly major functionality that myself personally I'm finding very, very useful. I'm working on the previews at the moment. And yeah, I'm going to give a rundown of the 3 main features that I'm interested in, and we'll also briefly touch on some of the other features that are coming in Xamarin Forms 4. So As Daki just pointed out, my name is Matthew Robbins. I've been working with Xamarin since 2012. I'm both a Microsoft and Xamarin MVP, and I got that from creating a product called mFractor. So if you're working on Visual Studio for Mac, I guess the closest comparison would be a ReSharper-esque tool. So we had a whole bunch of productivity gains for the Visual Studio for Mac Xamarin development experience. If you're interested, head to www.mfractor.com to check it out. I'd love to have you as part of the mFractor family. So today I'm covering 3 of the main flagship features that are in Xamarin Forms 4. Just a quick note, there's many, many more features in Xamarin Forms 4, but for this presentation, I just want to cover the 3 features that I find most interesting and most appealing. These are Shell, Collection View, and the font image source. So what are they? Well, Shell at a high level is a simplified way to declare your navigation hierarchy using XAML. It's quite useful because you get a top-level view of the entire navigation structure of your application defined in XAML rather than C#. There's some advantages to this. It makes your navigation hierarchy easier to be refactored and changed, but I'll go into that in more detail in a couple of minutes. I'll also go into Collection View, which is the spiritual successor to List View. It's a lot more flexible than List View. Again, we'll go into this later. And also, I'll speak about font image source, which is the ability to use font icons or a font such as Font Awesome and apply them to system elements as images. And this is very, very powerful. It's a small feature, but it's a very, very powerful feature. So first off the bat is Shell. Basically, Shell lets you define in XAML the way that your application should be laid out. So this is the navigation hierarchy. So should it be a one-page app? Should it have a flyout menu? Should it have bottom tabs, top tabs, or some kind of variation of all those composed together? To structure Shell, we now have these new concepts in XAML, which are, so you have a top-level item named Shell. Inside Shell, you have Shell items. So Shell items are used to describe either flyout behaviors or tabs, or top or bottom tabs. And inside Shell items, you have Shell sections and Shell contents. And the way that you compose these together changes how your application is laid out. So there's no longer the need to declare a master detail page and then manually inject each of the pages. By simply changing the structure and the nesting behavior of this file, you effectively change how your application renders. And this is quite cool. So as I said, it becomes very, very easy for us to then make a one-page app or a two-page with top tabs, with bottom and top tabs, with a flyout or any variation of these. So with Shell, we can mix and match all the different navigation paradigms. And we can also push shells on top of each other. So a shell conceptually derives from Xamarin Forms.page. So you can push multiple shells on top of each other modally to get a very, very flexible application. I personally find this quite cool. Another benefit of Shell is that you get free URL navigation. So if you're using a framework like Prism, for instance, one of the benefits of Prism is when you're navigating, you can do it via a URL rather than pushing pages and popping pages. In Shell, this looks like this. So you define the route host, and the route scheme, and these all come together for us to then do our navigation. So just give me 1 second. I think that my animations in the slide are being ignored. Oh, they're all good. Sorry for that. So after we've defined our route host, and our route scheme, so route host being a website, the route scheme being app or HTTPS, HTTP, and the route being the /main component, we can then define routes on each of our shell items, shell section, and shell contents. And this builds effectively a deep link to any portion of our application. So here I've defined routes on my shell item, my shell section, and a shell content. And this would then build up to give me this fully qualified URL. So if I went back and compared to the previous slide, I've defined the scheme as app, the host as www.myapp.com, and then each of the route components build up on top of each other to give us a full deep link. This is quite cool because it then gives us deep linking support out of the box. If you've ever had to write a deep linking engine, and I've done this a couple of times over the years, it's not easy, and I still get it wrong, and I've probably done it. So for us to no longer have to deal with that complexity, and for Xamarin to provide it out of the box, that's a huge win for us. And again, the nice thing for this is that we can then use the shell to navigate by URL. So we can do this using a fully qualified URL, or we could simply do main repeated pages custom to navigate to that particular section. So we're now decoupled from the concept of pages and pushing and popping pages, and we can just simply throw a URL at the navigation engine, and it resolves it all for us. One of the cool things about this is that it doesn't build up the page stack, so there's no cost to the in-between pages for, say, repeater or pages. If there's any kind of page in between that, they're virtualized, and they're not constructed, and we don't bear the cost of them until we actually visit them. Normally, when you're doing navigation in your applications, or this is how I've worked, you would build up each of the pages as you're going through the navigation stack. Xamarin Forms handles that for you, and you don't wear the cost of it anymore. Now, another interesting thing that you can see here in this navigation demo is that we have query parameters. So at the end of the custom, we have question mark source equals to buildings. So Shell also supports injection via URL parameters. Using this query property. So query property is an attribute that we can apply onto our pages or our view models. And Xamarin Forms will resolve the name to a property inside our page or view model. And it'll look inside a URL for this secondary name, so for source. It'll take the value, and then via reflection, it'll automatically apply the value into our page or view model. Again, this is really, really handy because it means that you can suddenly start injecting multiple URL parameters, and as you navigate to the page, it will just appear. So they'll just get set up. Again, very, very useful. Another benefit of Shell is that you can easily white label your application. So you can apply different pages and different branding styles based on data binding and dynamic resources to the whole application. Because Shell is derived from the derived from bindable object, you can have an app, you can apply the view model concept to the entire navigation hierarchy, which is a little bit meta. It's interesting concept. Took me a little while to get my head around it, but it allows for a lot of power, because what it means is that I can have a view model, for instance. I thought I had it highlighted. I can have a view model that, say, toggles on and off sections of the application using data binding. So down here in my flyout header, I've set it up so that when I tap on the app header, it only processes the tap event if I'm an admin, and I've done that via data binding. So effectively excluding an entire part of the application just by using standard MVVM concepts. So this is an example application that I wrote to demonstrate white labeling. Left and right, two different applications. Left one is an Apples application, right one is an Acorns application. Effectively, they're the same app. All I've done differently is use data binding and dynamic resources to change the iconography, the application name, and the color scheme. Now, again, using data binding on the view models for sure. So if we just take a step back and do a retrospective of what Shell has to offer, in terms of benefits, it gives you a declarative navigation structure. One of the key benefits of this is that by having your entire navigation laid out in one XAML file, you now gain a bird's eye view of the navigation hierarchy, and this in turn makes it easy to refactor. So if you've had clients like I've had, they can be a little bit fickle and don't quite know what they want until the last minute. So they'll put you down the path of, say, we want a flyout menu, and then 2 days before they want you to ship it, they'll say, hang on, we want bottom tabs. In the past, making this change from flyout to bottom tabs, it's a lot more work. It's a bit tricky. With Shell, simply by changing the nesting structure in that Shell file, that will then change what the change, making huge hierarchy changes to your application becomes a whole lot easier. Another benefit is that it's much easier to white label the application through a bindable navigation structure. So we get view model concepts now for the entire navigation structure. We get URL navigation support for free, which is very useful because this in turn means we get deep link support out of the box. And we also get URL argument injection out of the box. If I'm going to give a balanced perspective here, which is kind of what I try to do in my presentations, there are a few drawbacks that I've seen. The first one is that if you have an existing application that's already coded against a framework such as Prism or FreshMVVM, this Shell is going to be quite difficult to retrofit into those existing applications. So my personal recommendation is that if you have existing apps, I probably would step away and maybe reconsider Shell for the moment. So I probably wouldn't touch it. If you have an application in production and it's working, Shell's probably not for you. If you're working on a greenfield application, so a new app that a client's giving you, I think Shell is a perfect thing for that. Shell is still in preview, so the API surface is changing. As such, we're not 100% sure what the final product would look like. So if you do start using Shell today, just bear in mind that there's a technical risk down the line that what you code now, it might change if Xamarin decides that the way they've done it now needs a rethink based on customer feedback. And finally, because it is in preview, it does have some bugs. This is just a way of life. You know, this happens. They're fixing them. They fixed a lot since I gave this first presentation in Melbourne, maybe about 6-7 weeks ago. But yes, it does have some bugs still. But when they ship it, I'm sure that it will be rock solid. So next up is collection view. Collection view is the successor to list view. So with list view, we have a vertical scrolling singular list. Collection view allows us to define a much more flexible kind of list or a kind of collection. So if you've ever had to do, say, a horizontal scrolling list, typically you would have to bring in a third-party component or code it yourself or write a custom renderer for that. Collection view now supports that out of the box. It supports grid structure, list structure, horizontal and vertical scrolling, as well as the concept of snap points. So if you scroll halfway up a list element, you can tell it to snap to the top of it, to the bottom of it, which is quite nice. In terms of what it looks like, it looks exactly like a normal list, so like a normal list view. We have a collection view element. We have item source where we data bind to whatever our list is. So in this case, it's data binding to a list of items. We have an item template, which involves a data template. And inside that, we define what our view looks like. Additionally, we have a new item called an items layout. So a new property called an items layout. This is a first-time initialization that we would do, that we tell the collection view how it should render. So should it be a grid? Should it be a list? Should it have vertical scrolling? Should it have horizontal scrolling? If it has snap points, what do they look like? Where does it snap to? All the kind of information that the collection view needs to effectively render itself up front. Again, we define our cells using a data template. An interesting thing about the collection view is that the concept of a view cell is no longer relevant. So Xamarin decided to remove that view cell abstraction concept. In my opinion, this is a good thing because the less abstractions and layers of the onion we have to work with, the better. So if you do have an existing list view that you want to bring to a collection view, just bear in mind this inner view cell, that's no longer needed. In my initial testing, it's probably about 6 to 8 weeks ago, if you had the view cell in here, when you ported it to a list view to collection view, it would crash the application. So just keep that in mind, that you no longer need this. And lastly, one of the very, very cool things that a collection view has to offer is it has automatic support for an empty collection. So say that this item source binding items is null or empty. So there's no items in the list, basically. Historically, if we wanted to show some kind of sad face saying, "I'm sorry, the search will return no," we have to go through all kinds of hoops to make a separate view from the collection view, from the list view, to show this condition in the UI. Collection view has this out of the box by default with this property called empty view. So this is much like the concept of a header or a footer in the existing list view, but this view simply appears when there's nothing to render, nothing to display. So this is an example of before the empty collection view was added. This is how I do it, at least, or how I have done it in the past. We define an outer container such as a grid. This contains both our list view and our placeholder view, so our empty items view. You have a data binding is visible to has items. Either you do this with like a value converter that says is null or empty. You need the same one on the empty placeholder view, and you effectively need to overlay them on top of each other. So there's a lot of complexity happening in the user interface here. And in terms of just a long-term, technical strategy perspective, this is a bit of tech debt. Every time someone has to come into this page and maintain it, there's a lot of code here that can go wrong. So if someone changes the wrong thing, they can generate bugs. It's just software development. It's just a fact of life. So anything that we can do to reduce the amount of code, that's a win in my books. So the new one greatly simplifies that. So it cuts out the entire wrapping code and just puts the empty placeholder view into a single property in the collection view. So I mean, if you just look at the before, we have tons of extra unneeded code here that just adds complexity and adds potential for bugs. And the new one, much smaller, much easier to work with, less potential for bugs, easy to maintain. It's wins all around, in my opinion. In summary, so for the collection view, some of the benefits that we're seeing, that I've been seeing, like I've just said in the last few slides, an immediate benefit is an automatic empty view. This is tricky, basically, to code yourself. So anything that Xamarin can do to make it easier is a huge win. It's a simpler XAML usage and a simpler API surface. So by removing the concept of a view cell, that we need to think about when working with collections, and that makes it easy to work with. We get snap points out of the box. We also get grid and list support and horizontal and vertical scrolling. So all very beneficial things. Unfortunately, it does have some drawbacks. I actually need to follow up with David Ott now, the Xamarin Forms product manager, to double check if some of these things have been resolved. But at the time of writing this slide, there were a few things that were missing from the collection view. So for starters, there's no pull to refresh support, or at least there wasn't when I first wrote this talk. For me, that's unfortunately a deal breaker for porting to collection view. I'm sure that they will have fixed it by the time they release this into production. There's no grouping support, or there wasn't. So if you wanted to have a title, so basically lists of lists, that wasn't supported. There was no header and footer support. So if you wanted to have at the bottom, 10 of 100 items, that always was fixed in the bottom portion of the list view, or some kind of header view that scrolled in and out of view as you sort up and down the list. Supported. Again, I need to double check this, but I'm sure they will add the support for the Xamarin Forms 4 final release. And there's also some stability issues. Again, this is a preview, so that's to be expected. So I would say if the no pull to refresh, the no grouping, and the no header support, if they're not deal breakers for you, go ahead and upgrade to Xamarin Forms 4 and start using the collection view. Long term, it'll add a lot of benefits, more than losing this functionality has. But just keep in mind there might be some stability issues because you are working on a preview. On the line of the collection view, just a small bonus feature that I wanted to go into that was released in, I think, Xamarin Forms 3.5 or 3.6. It's the concept of a repeater view. So given a collection of items, and then you just want to render them multiple times, so you want to reuse a single view in say a stack layout or a grid. Historically, you'd have to do this in code behind, using a for each loop and manually constructing things. Xamarin Forms now has the concept of a repeater view. So this is a couple of different properties that are exposed now in the API. But basically, we have this bindable layout item source attached property and bindable layout item template. And by combining these two in a visual layout, so a stack layout or a grid or a relative layout or what have you, we now get a repetition of items without having to resort to code behind. So in my mind, this is a very, very useful feature that if you've ever had to reuse a single view and inject it multiple times into a layout container, shifting it into XAML is quite a big benefit. Next up is font image source. So this is the last of the three major features that I wanted to speak about. And this is probably the one that I'm most excited for. And hopefully you get a sense of why I'm excited for this. Basically, the proposition for a font image source is being able to easily use glyph icons. So to use the font image source, it's much like any other image source, like a URL image source or a local image source. You simply just use it inside where an image source is accepted. Where the font image source differs is that you provided three main this is provided the font family. So on iOS and Android, this is an OTF or a TTF file. In my case, I've got some helper code here to look up Font Awesome 5 Pro Solid and a color. And what font image source does is that it takes these three pieces of information, so the character code, the font family, and the color, and it renders this at runtime into an image that directly matches the required dimensions for that image element. So you're probably thinking, well, we've already got labels that we can do this, where we provide, a font family and a glyph code and a color, and we get it all for free. However, labels don't work for system icons. So the really, really cool thing about a font image source is that we can now use font families and font icons on any system element. So the big example of this, right, is you have a tab bar, so a bottom tab bar. On iOS, and I think also on Android, you need to know the exact dimensions of that bottom tab bar, so what the iconography needs to be. And if you don't, if you look here, you'll see that one of these doesn't look right. And basically, because I'm using just a standard image source here, so for this shell section, for the icon in the tab bar, just using a standard grid icon, it doesn't fit. And this is only like 10 pixels oversized. But nonetheless, to fix this, I need to resize the @1x, @2x, and @3x image. If I'm using a font image source, it automatically figures this out for me, and I no longer bear the cognitive load of needing to know the exact size of what that system icon has to be. I just simply use a font image source with the character code, font family, and color, and the Xamarin Forms font image source engine figures the rest out for me. This is going to save heaps of work. It's a very, very beneficial small API chain, but with huge repercussions. So, as you can see, this is probably the one that I'm most passionate about because it's an issue that I've experienced so many times. And just to have it solved so simply and so elegantly. So, in summary, for the font image source, in terms of benefits and drawbacks, the benefits is being able to easily use a font and icon or character code as an image source. And this is very, very useful for system elements like tab bars and menu items. Unfortunately, just to give a balanced perspective, there are some drawbacks to this. There is a runtime cost of having to convert that icon into an image. It does have to rasterize it into a bitmap or a PNG and then display that into the UI. That's an expensive thing to do. I believe it only happens once, but it still has to do it. And it's significantly more expensive than drawing a font or an SVG. As such, it's only useful for specific scenarios. And these specific scenarios are tab bars, menu items, basically system elements where you would need to know the exact dimension of an image. So you wouldn't go ahead and use the font image source all throughout the application. You would use it with precision on certain elements like tab bars and menu items. You would never use this in a loose view, for instance. This would cause performance issues. So in summary, if you needed to use a font for a character in a list, I would use a label using your family. If you need to use it for a system element, font image sources is the better way to go. So I'm just going to quickly jump into a demo. We'll just start this up. This demonstrates a couple of the concepts that I've covered today. So this is my app shell. I'll just zoom in because I'm sure that that is way too small for you, looking at that on a projector. Anyway. Sometimes I come back into my demos after playing with them and I forget what I've changed. So apologies for my compilation breakages. So this is just to kind of recap. In Shell, this is an example of a four tab four-page bottom tab page. If that makes sense. If I wanted to turn this into four tabs at the top, I can go and uncomment this shell section here. If Visual Studio Map will let me. And all we have to do is just to simply take all those pages and paste them in here. And that would do it for me. This is an example of a single page in a flyout menu. So for reference, each of these shell items inside this shell, they're a separate flyout menu item. We'll just see if I can start up the application to show you. Another really, really neat thing, because this is XAML, I can refactor and restructure everything to be much, much cleaner. So as I was building this, I realized that one of my sections, so one of my shell items, was getting really large. So what I did is that I refactored out an entire application section into its own discrete class. And this is pretty cool because what it means is that if you're a vendor, right, you could effectively make a single shell item that defines a whole portion of an application and ship that. So where are we? Here we go. So this is my application. Repeat examples using top tabs. Selection view. So this is this structure here. So each of these shell sections. So we have like shell section, title, grid, horizontal. That maps to this. We're using a font image source with the glyph. With the glyph code to render the system icon. We've got one of those for each of them. So we have 5 different sections defined in our UI. We can actually simplify this quite a lot if we wanted to. Like I believe that I could say just simply take out that and move it up. If we wanted our code to be cleaner, but I prefer to just be 100% clear on what things do. In terms of, so I'll just go into some areas and show you some collection view samples. This is my example page for using a collection view. I've got an empty placeholder view. I have a data template that renders out a font icon. And then I've got some different examples of each of the collection views. So this is a horizontal scrolling list, a horizontal scrolling grid with 2 rows. We have a vertical scrolling grid with 2 columns, a horizontal scrolling list. And keep in mind that all of this is defined using a data binding layout type. So you see here, all I'm doing is I'm building up a different list or grid items layout with the parameters that control that behavior. So for my vertical list, you see here that I'm defining snap points, which is pretty useful. So if I scroll halfway up the baseball, the snap point dictates that it automatically will scroll that element fully visible. So same with tennis here. So that's a tricky thing to build yourself. Anyway, I'll jump back out of that demo. You can ask me some questions about it at the end. Just a quick roundup of some of the other features that are included in Xamarin Forms, Xamarin Forms 4. So if you've had to use a carousel view, so this is a horizontally scrolling collection of different visual elements. This is now coming natively in Xamarin Forms 4. Historically, they've had a preview component for the last few years. If I'm going to be honest, so it's great to see it's finally getting love that it deserves, because this is an element that people commonly use in applications. Another really, really big one is visual. So this is the ability to make Android and iOS applications look exactly the same, or to apply effectively a theme across your entire app. So, for example, the first visual that they've released is a material visual. So if you like the material style guide, so material Google, material design, so this is the that's used on Android. And if your clients like that and they want to use it on iOS, you can now do this using this concept called visual. So visual will make both applications more or less look the same. And you do this by adding a another NuGet package to Android and iOS projects, and simply calling them the visual style. So in this case, material .net, and that'll apply it across the whole app. So this is some examples of what it looks like. Yeah. F100. So this is basically going through and looking at the APIs that are exposed and all the different controls, and just fixing all the paper cuts. So for instance, on a text editor, adding the ability to turn off spell check, for instance. So the whole focus of F100 is what are the things that people are writing effects for and renderers for, and let's improve the API service so that they can do that without having to resort to using renderers and effects. And this is predominantly a community-led effort. And lastly, in Xamarin Forms 4, Xamarin Essentials, so essential cross-platform device APIs. This provides a simple API service for say, accessing email, or accessing the thermometer, or accessing GPS. Effectively, Xamarin Essentials is already out in the wild, but it kind of comes under the Xamarin Forms 4 umbrella in that it improves the entire Xamarin Forms experience. Excuse me, just have some tea. Okay, so in summary, the key takeaways from this presentation is the best spoke about. Shell gives you the ability to easily define your navigation hierarchy. So with the mate, gives us like a bird's eye view of what our app's navigation looks like. Collection view is the flexible successor list view. We can define grids, we can define lists, we can scroll horizontally and vertically. It opens up a whole lot of options for our UIs. And lastly, font image source gives us the ability to turn font icons into images, simplifying applying icons into system elements like tab bars and menu items. So yeah, that is me all done. I'm just going to stop sharing and transfer it back over to you guys. So
okay. Thank you, Matthew. So, ¿algunas preguntas? Some questions here? I was looking to the live stream on YouTube. No questions there. I think everything clear here.
cool. That's good.
¿Os gustan las novedades? Sí. I asked if the new features are great from Xamarin Forms.
Yeah, there's some good stuff. They've made it some very, very big leaps.
Okay. Then we will continue to our workshop with the news from Xamarin Forms and Shell. So thank you very much. I think it was really clear, and thank you very much you to stand up at this hour.
So good.
Okay.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
See you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
¿Te han gustado las novedades? ¿Sí?
Habla en español, sí.
Habla en español. ¿Tenéis ganas de escuchar español?
No, a mí no me ponga micro, que el Monkey Kong lo pasé muy mal, tío.
Sí.
Me gusta respirar.
No, era por si la hacemos seguir y compartimos tu pantalla y tal, o la hacemos... No, la hacemos...
Yo, vamos, si esto al final está
Ayer
en
no.
la voy a seguir la peña.